That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. Hey there, welcome to That's Enough Out of You. I am your host, Bill Rader, and joining me is my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, what's going on today, buddy?
Billy Raids, how's it going, buddy?
Doing pretty good. Can't complain. I know we usually do complain about the weather.
Wow, it's crazy, buddy. You never know what it's going to do.
Yeah, we had like a monsoon last night. It was seeing reports of like cars underwater and everything. Crazy.
Yeah, terrible.
Unbelievable.
It's unpredictable, pal. And getting worse.
Yeah. It seems like it. But I guess it depends on who you vote for, right?
Well, we might get into a little of that today because we got a great guest, and I'm really ready to get into this, Billy. This is going to be a fantastic episode.
All right, sounds good. So, we've got a great guest. Monika Wiesak is joining us, and she is the author of the book, America's Last President, What the World Lost When It Lost John F. Kennedy. So welcome, Monika.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you guys today.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. This is it's a fantastic. We do quite a bit of quite a number of our episodes are focused on JFK. Typically, we talk about the assassination and all of the conspiracy and all the things that were involved with the assassination, but it'd be nice change of pace to talk about, his presidency and the man himself and all the things that you cover in your book. So Sean, let's get going. We'll get started with this.
Yeah. And Monika, congratulations on the book, because it's really fantastic. I mean, you really, I think, captured a Kennedy in the book. And I think you wrote the book because of kind of the same reasons that we started this podcast, because we were kind of just, discussed what kind of a lot of the disinformation that's out there about Kennedy. So could you talk just a little bit about just a quick bio on yourself and why you decided to write the book?
Yeah, so I'm just a regular everyday citizen. I work in IT, so I never in my life imagined I would write a book, let alone write a book about Kennedy. But I have kind of had a certain curiosity in him since I was a little kid. I had seen a civil rights speech, which for me was really impressive as a young child. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And so it just kind of, I don't know, he came off as very sincere and compassionate, someone who had a lot of moral courage. But also growing up during that era, there was just constant tabloid stories and mainstream press stories about, how this guy's really shady. He's making deals with the mob. He's a drug addict. He's having all these affairs. He's trying to kill Castro, just on and on. So for me as a little kid, that was a little confusing, I guess, or I didn't really understand how propaganda worked, and so I was kind of like, who is this person, And then as I got older, I don't know, a lot of things didn't make sense to me. I was kind of wondering why our government was making certain decisions. And so one day, it was in 2008, I thought, well, let look back at this Kennedy guy a little bit and try to figure out what was going on there, because something just never really sat right with me. And so I slowly started reading Kennedy books. I didn't like a lot of them. They were following kind of that same TV image I had seen, where they were kind of writing about his sex life or his alleged sex life. And it wasn't really getting into what his policies were or who he was, or most importantly, what changed between Kennedy and Johnson. Like, did his death matter? Did we lose anything when he died, or did the status quo continue? But slowly I started reading more and more books, and I started getting into, I guess, more academic books that were, I guess, less sleazy and more informative. Books like on Africa and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then I think the last few years, particularly starting in 2020, I think I was becoming even more and more disillusioned with, I guess, how power was structured in America, or how it worked, or how our government was making decisions. And that's when I really started to deep dive into Kennedy and really try to understand, how did we get to today? And, what was he doing that was different from what our leadership is doing today? And I really wanted to understand that era of history. And to your point, I wanted to put something out there that gave people an idea of who this man was and what his policies were, because there were so many books about the assassination. There were so many books, trashy books about him, but nobody was really talking about what he was doing for Americans, what his policies were. And again, most importantly, what we all lost when he died. So I felt like that book was missing from the market. And so I felt like, because I had studied him a lot, I felt like it was almost like my responsibility to put something out there to kind of fill that gap. And to, like you said, to tell the truth about him and to defend his character and who he was, because I feel like it has been misreported and misconstrued for all these decades.
Yeah, it's almost like they assassinated him twice. They character assassinated him after he was assassinated. And we have a lot of authors on. We had Don McGovern on. He talked a lot about the Marilyn Monroe stuff, and we had Jim DiEugenio on. He talked a lot about old man Kennedy and the mob, and how most of that is disinformation and just character assassination, and it's just garbage that's put out there. So I really thank you for your book, because it's really just showed a greatness of Kennedy. But could you talk a little bit about the conspiracy, because the word conspiracy has kind of been, kind of demonized in the media. And we now know that it goes back to this 1967 memo that the CIA put out, where the word conspiracy theorist was used to kind of discredit, the Warren Commission, detractors, and Jim Garrison. So can you talk a little bit about how that word conspiracy theory is kind of like demonized and used and kind of weaponized in the media?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a whole chapter in my book about conspiracy theory. So, my book is What the World Lost When It Lost John F. Kennedy. And one of those things is cultural. So we used to be a society that asked questions, and JFK embodied that. Like, he was always asking questions. He was asking citizens to be engaged, to be active, to not just read a daily column and have their mind made up for them, is what he said. So don't trust everything you read in the papers, but really think about things yourself, question the experts. And that's how democracy functions. And as you said, in 1967, after the Warren Report came out, people were starting to question. It didn't really make sense, the whole magic bullet theory and stuff. And, people were, and the Vietnam War was raging, and people were just wondering, what is going on? Are they telling us the truth about what happened to Kennedy? And so to kind of combat that, they started using the term conspiracy theory and using it in a very derogatory way. So basically, if you question power, you're a nut job. That's kind of how they tried to deal with that. And that term has just become so ubiquitous over the decades that no matter what you try to question, no matter what narrative you try to question, you get labeled a nut job, a conspiracy theorist. And it doesn't matter whether your questions are valid or whether they're clearly absurd. Everybody gets put in the exact same category. And it's a very like, the cultural damage done to our country as a result of the Kennedy assassination, I think, is not talked about enough and is not understood enough. And so I did try to write about that in the book, that, we lost all these things when JFK died, but we also lost our culture.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. I think, I mean, anybody that looks at the stuff going on today, I mean, I don't know how anybody could say that it's not a complete disaster. And I think, it does, the genesis of that does go back to the assassination and the cover up. When you kill a president in broad daylight like that and then cover it up, and most of the people today, I think, realize that, maybe they won't say it, but I think most people believe that, was a conspiracy and that Oswald wasn't the lone assassin. And I think you're right. It has done, unbelievable damage to the country.
Yeah, there's actually an author I like, Charles Eisenstein. He wrote an article that helped inspire me to write my book. And he said the Kennedy assassination is like a cancer that has metastasized to such an extent that nobody even knows the source anymore. And that has just bred all this corruption through the decades, because corruption breeds more corruption and lies breed more lies. So we've just gotten to the point where it's just all corruption and lies. And, like he said, nobody really knows the source anymore.
Well, let's dive into a little bit of stuff on your book. One of the things that really impressed me was you talked about how Jackie Kennedy really knew a lot about JFK's policies, and that was very interesting to me. Could you talk a little bit about that, and if you could tell this orphanage, because I think that was fascinating.
Yeah, so I listened to her oral history. It was about 8 to 10 hours long. Maybe she recorded it, I think, in 3 or 4 sessions in early 1964. So not that long after her husband's death. And I was also really surprised in terms of how much she understood about his policies, because I had kind of been under the impression that maybe she didn't know, that much about his day-to-day work, but she was quite informed on it. So I definitely would recommend to anybody listening to her oral history. It's available on Amazon. And in terms of the orphanage thing, so she told a story when she was in an orphanage in Venezuela, I think it was, and all the children were hugging her and kissing her goodbye. And the paper put out a headline, something like, "Oh my God, look, she lets herself or allows herself to be kissed by these children." And she said Jack was just so heartbroken over that because, he felt like the United States had given Latin America an inferiority complex. And that headline was sort of implying that, that she was better than those kids and, how amazing that she allowed herself to be kissed by those kids. And she just said that he was really, really hurt by that headline and sort of the way that we were treating her, the people in Latin America were being treated.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Let's talk a little bit, because one of the things I love about your book is that you really covered a lot of areas that I don't think people talk about enough, JFK's policies. And one of them was the surplus food program, where Kennedy was really worried about, people getting enough nutritional food and especially like poor people. Can you talk a little bit about that and what he did?
Yeah. So when he was campaigning, he had a big primary there in West Virginia, and he toured all the like small towns in West Virginia, and he saw how hungry people were and how little food they were getting. So when he actually went to a primary debate in West Virginia, he actually brought a can of powdered eggs to the debate. And he read off like what people are fed, how much food they get a month. And he's like, this is not an acceptable diet for any American. So it wasn't just the quantity of food that people received that he was concerned about. It was also the quality of food. Like he was concerned about people actually getting nutrition, because you can feed people all kinds of crap, but that doesn't mean they're getting any nutrition. And so he was concerned not just about people being fed, but about people being nourished. And I think that's a really important distinction to understand. And so when he became president, his very first executive order, and I think you can tell a lot about a president by their first executive order. So his very first executive order, he doubled both the amount of food being given and increased the quality of food. Particularly, he added a lot of protein to the food that was distributed. So both the value of the food doubled and the number of people receiving the food doubled just with that one signature and his executive order. And then I think it was in one of his first few press conferences, he said, we need to do even more. Like, this isn't enough. This is all I could do or all I had, the means to do, but we need to figure out ways to do even more. So he was really concerned, about people being fed properly. And then actually in the summer of 1963, he gave a speech, I think it was to the World Food Congress. I can't remember, but he basically said like hunger on this planet is just not acceptable in the 1960s, and that this is a problem that we have the means to solve, we have the ability to solve, we just have to want to solve it. And he said it's morally unacceptable if we don't solve this problem in the 1960s. And he was talking about hunger for the entire planet, not just Americans, when he gave that speech. So it makes you wonder like what he would have done, you know, in his second term to address this issue, because it's definitely an issue he cared very, very much about.
And when you think Monika, that's go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, when you think about how important nutrition is, you know, like you said, you can give people crap to eat, but it's only going to exacerbate the issue, because now they're going to, you know, people are going to have health issues. They're going to, you know, I mean, you can drop off, you know, McDonald's and all kinds of, you know, junk for people to eat. But now, you know, now you're talking about they're going to have obesity issues. They're going to have all kinds of health problems from eating junk food. And so he was so, you know, so right about that. And I can't even imagine, you know, a politician in his position, you know, a presidential candidate in today's day and age proposing something like that. It just doesn't, you know, it doesn't have, I mean, we hear those words a lot, but they're usually empty words. And this was a guy who really cared. You know, he cared about the citizens of this country. It didn't matter to him whether they were Republican or Democrat or whatever. He wanted people to live good, healthy lives. And you just don't see that today from any politician.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. You know, and he had a lot of forethought, to your point. If people are healthy, medical expenses are going to be cheaper, you know, exactly. And taxes are going to be cheaper, you know. Yep. So he really wanted a strong America, and he understood that part of having a strong America is having healthy people. And, you know, it wasn't just food, it was also his exercise. You know, he promoted fitness programs, and he was always talking about the need for kids to exercise. And not just kids, but, you know, elderly people throughout all life. You know, he gave several speeches about how important fitness was, how important, you know, walking was instead of riding everywhere. And so you're right. Yeah, he really did care about the health of every American. He really wanted, I mean, he was everything you'd imagine a president should be. You know, a president should care about every citizen of his country. A president should care about their health, their well-being, their strength, you know, their education, all of those things he cared deeply about. And you don't see that, I agree with you, at all today. I mean, it's just insane.
But Monika, one thing you said earlier is that, you know, it wasn't just America that he cared about, though. It was the worldview and the planet in general that Kennedy cared about, and the citizens of the world, not just American citizens. Yeah, that's what I think was so amazing about him.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's so obvious that he was siding with the common person globally, you know, in Latin America, Africa, everywhere, really. And you don't see that today at all. You know what I mean? Our presidents side with whoever their donors are, you know, Wall Street or whatever it may be, or oligarchs. They don't side with the little guy in the village who's just trying to feed his kids. So it's really amazing that he even got into the White House, to tell you the truth, because I don't think the presidents before him were that great either. I mean, I think they were probably certainly better than what we have today, probably. But I think he was just really unique in that he really believed in the American ideal, which I think
it shocked the system too. Like when Kennedy got in.
No, absolutely. I think it was a shock to the system, because they're like, you know, even though we had democracy, maybe it was always controlled to a certain extent, you know, or those leaders that got into that position more or less served wealth and power. Now, I don't think wealth and power was concentrated as they are today, but usually people who get into those kind of positions tend to do so because they're serving wealthy people. But Kennedy had a lot of his own money. You know, he was really idealistic, and he ran for the presidency for the right reasons. So you're right. I think it was a shock to the system to be like, hey, wait a minute, this guy's now in a position of power, and he's making decisions that are not benefiting the oligarchy, but that are actually benefiting humanity as a whole.
And I think people that, you know, were in power, people that were wealthy, like the Rockefellers and people like that, I think they viewed Kennedy, because he was wealthy, as kind of a traitor to his own wealth class.
Oh, definitely. I think he was definitely viewed as a traitor to his class.
And the next thing I want to talk about is just an amazing thing that you had in there about what Kennedy was worried about pesticides and massive environmental harm that they were doing, and how he went around the USDA and then how he took on big pharma, went around the FDA and had drugs removed. So can you talk a little bit about that? Start with the pesticides first.
Yeah, so I'm a huge health nut. So these were like really big things for me and really impressive to me. So Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring, and it was about pesticides and DDT and the environmental harm they were causing to animals, to insects, and to humans, because we're all like one entity, really, we're all connected by nature. And she's saying you can't just put something into nature and expect it not to impact other parts of nature, including human beings, and impact their health and their well-being and whatnot. And so the USDA thought her book was a public relations problem, because they were already kind of in bed with the chemical industry to an extent, and Kennedy said, no, I want to look at this book seriously. I want to find out if she's right or wrong. I want to find out, if these things are harming human health, if they're harming the environment, or if they're not. So he actually had his own presidential science advisory committee do a study on pesticides, an intense study on pesticides, to determine whether Rachel Carson was right or wrong. And they came out with a report in May of 1963 that basically said, yeah, Rachel Carson was right. And that report came with a bunch of recommendations for legislative changes, for much stricter testing. They wanted to test like multiple generations and multiple mammals and, test synergism. So like, when multiple chemicals are mixed together, or that synergism between if you take certain drugs and pesticides, what does that mean? Because if maybe two chemicals together are 10 times more harmful than they are individually, things like that. And he wanted to train doctors on pesticide-induced health issues, because he felt like doctors, people come in with chronic diseases and doctors want to give you a pill, but maybe they don't really understand what's causing your chronic disease. And can we get rid of the cause so you don't have that chronic disease in the first place? And so he was wanted to pursue all these recommendations. Now, obviously, he died about 5-6 months later, so none of that really happened. So it is interesting to think about, with this pesticide issue that is so rampant today, and everybody's eating toxins. Like you go to the grocery store, like all the food there is loaded with toxins, right? It doesn't say poison on the box, but a lot of it is poison that you're eating. And you wonder if that would have been different had Kennedy lived, and what he would have done about it. Would he have followed through on those recommendations as he said he was going to? And in terms of the FDA, so there was a drug scandal around thalidomide. Now, actually, even before that scandal, Kennedy gave a consumer rights pledge, and I think it was, March 15th, 1962, which today is considered World Consumer Rights Day, in honor of his speech. And so in that speech, he talked about the rights that consumers have in regards to all products. He talked about right to safety, right to choose, right to be informed, right to be heard. And one of those products was drugs. And he said, we need much better disclosure around side effects of drugs. And we also need to test efficacy. So at that point, the FDA was only testing safety. They weren't testing efficacy. So you could put a drug out there and say it helps headaches, but you don't have to prove that it does. You just have to prove that the side effects aren't too bad. And so Kennedy's like, no, that's not acceptable. You have to prove efficacy as well as safety. And so later that spring, there was a scandal over a drug called thalidomide, which was like a headache, nausea drug, and it was causing birth defects. And there was an FDA employee, Frances Kelsey, that she was getting massive pressure from the pharmaceutical company, but she refused to approve the drug. It had been distributed a lot through clinical trials, and it was distributed in Germany, which is where they found out about these birth defects. And then Kennedy gave her the highest award you can give a civilian for not approving that drug, which is insane when you think about it today, because the FDA's job is to not approve drugs, because if they're going to simply approve everything, there's no point of their existence, right? The point of their existence is to stop the bad stuff from going through. So they should be disapproving some things. Otherwise, they're not stopping anything from going through. And so he gave her an award. He understood what the job of the FDA was. And then a couple months later, he signed legislation that basically forced them to do efficacy studies in addition to safety studies, forced greater disclosure of side effects. And it also forced retroactive efficacy studies going back 25 years. So by the early, I think 1970s, some 600 drugs had been removed from the market because of that
Wow.
law, because they were retested and they were deemed not to be effective for what they were claiming to be effective for. So yeah, I think it's pretty impressive. Like, he wasn't scared to go against big industries like the chemical industry or the pharma industry. He was going to do his job as president, which was to serve the average American. And he said, when you have the reason he said consumer rights are so important is he said they're even more important to the well-being of a family than their income is, because you can keep increasing people's income, but if they're getting horrible products or they're being lied to about what they're purchasing, then their living standards are not actually going up. They might even be going down, even as their income is going up. So he explained that. And so I think he really, going back to his first executive order, I think he really cared about the well-being of every American. And the way he handled pesticides, the way he handled drugs, the way he handled consumer rights shows that, just as his first executive order showed that.
And, speaking of that, Monika, I mean, you think about today and what we see, even just like on television, every other commercial is a pharmaceutical, some sort of a drug. They're trying to convince you that you have these problems and you need to talk to your doctor about getting this drug. And, the commercials are usually people having picnics and birds flying around, and then they list the side effects, and like some of the side effects you scratch your head and you say, why would I ever want to take this drug? But it's amazing. I can't imagine JFK would ever have allowed that to happen, where where these pharmaceutical industry could start advertising on television for these drugs. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and I think people have become so desensitized to it, so that when you get to the end of the commercial and you get that long list of side effects, I think people just ignore it and say, well, I'm not going to be one of the people that gets one of those side effects.
Sure. Right. I'm not going to be the person that dies tragically, from taking this drug. And yet people do, which is why they have to put it on there.
Yeah.
Makes absolutely, I mean, and then to convince you to talk to your doctor about taking, your doctor should be the one telling you what medications you need to take, not the other way around. It's just, it's surreal what's happening today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think he'd be like shocked.
Sure.
It's just, yeah, it's insane. But I think, like, our government serves industry. So, that's good for pharma. That's what they do.
Sure. Absolutely.
And Monika, the next thing, Kennedy was so worried about was the environment and the way that people were treating the planet, and how he was going after the people that, were polluting the planet, including the military, which was the greatest polluters of Earth. And talk a little bit about JFK's view of the environment and the view of the philosopher Thomas Malthus, because there's so, a lot of these guys like Rockefeller, subscribe to that view of Malthus, and it's just so different than what Kennedy's view was. Could you just, describe the differences between them?
Yeah, so Malthus was someone who was around in the early 1800s, and he was basically blaming environmental issues on the poor. His idea was we have limited resources on Earth. We can't have all these poor peasants using up these resources, because they're going to take the resources away from the wealthy. And so their idea was basically to make people live in poverty, and that's the way to deal with environmentalism. And you see that today with like the Great Reset and stuff. You should eat bugs, and it's like, you guys, the masses, need to stop what you're doing. Because you're ruining the planet, while we fly in our jets to Davos or whatever. So that's really the Malthusian view. And Kennedy's view was basically, he wanted everyone to have a good life. He was accused of promoting the lust for industrialization. So he did want third world countries to industrialize. He really believed that he said in a lot of speeches that resources are unlimited if we're wise and we're smart and we use science to use these resources wisely. And he got excited about conservation increasing people's lives. So he would talk about, we can get more fish from the ocean. This will like double the amount of protein that people get, so they live less lives, I think is what he said. And that doesn't mean that he didn't think there was environmental harm, but he was going after the big players, like with the nuclear test ban treaty. Like, it's just mind blowing that people were just dropping these bombs to me. You know what I mean? Like that they thought this was a good idea. And just the environmental damage that was doing, right? And our military still to this day is the biggest polluter on the planet. But nobody says a peep about that, right? They don't say, well, maybe we should cut back. Maybe we should stop dropping bombs on people. Maybe that will help the environment, right? No, nobody says that. So, Kennedy realized that environmental harm doesn't come from the little guy, right? It comes from these chemical companies, it comes from the military, and that's who he was going after. He was saying, why are we spraying all these pesticides? Why are we dropping all these bombs? And what's the impact that's having on the environment? He wasn't saying, okay, this poor person in Africa can't eat because they're using too many resources, and which is really the Malthus view. And so I think people really need to understand that and think about what sort of environmentalism we should be promoting and encouraging, and what kind we should not be promoting and encouraging.
What do you think he would think about what's happening today, though? I mean, we have clearly we have climate change, right? I mean, we have weather that we've never experienced before. We have an island of plastic off the Pacific where fish are either getting caught in this or ingesting it. I mean, it's a total nightmare what's going on today.
Yeah. And I think, he talked about the quote unquote raiders, which are, the sort of those that use public resources for private profit. And I think we've seen that over the last 60 years where that has gotten us. So I think he would be very disturbed by what he sees today, and that we've essentially done nothing about the quote unquote raiders that he referred to. We've just let it run rampant for 60 years straight. And it doesn't seem like we're really doing anything to stop it. We're following the solutions of like Bill Gates, who wants to block the sun, or like, you know what I mean? And we're not really addressing the issues. Like, we're still dropping the bombs. We're still spreading the pesticides. And so, I think his views would probably be really similar to RFK Jr.'s when it comes to the environment. Obviously, nobody really can speak for him, and it's hard to say because it's a different era, but I do think he would be really disappointed in what he sees. And I do think he would be going after the big players and not obsessing over, the little guy's contribution to where we've gotten.
But it's become a political issue, of course, as usual. And even, you mentioned RFK Jr., he's on, in mainstream media, he's identified as a kook. So nobody, the public at large is not going to get to hear anything that he talks about because of how the mainstream media characterizes him.
Yeah, and that's really sad, because he's obviously a very intelligent, thoughtful, educated person. And the fact that people can't see, a lot of people can see that, but the fact that a lot of people can't see that because of the media portrayal of him, I think is really sad, because at least to me, it's so obvious that like he's way, 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 way better than Biden. But that seems to, a lot of people are not seeing that, unfortunately.
Sean, go ahead. I know.
Here's a direct quote from JFK. He said, the common enemy of man is tyranny, poverty, disease, and war. And that's pretty much the exact opposite of what Malthus was basically saying.
Yes. No, you're right. Exactly.
So, I mean, it's just, I've always been a JFK fan right from the beginning, because my dad was a huge JFK guy, and I was just kind of born into it. But the thing is, the more I read about him and the more I got into the research on him, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that he was the best president that we've ever seen. And I think because of that assassination, the fallout of that is kind of the mess that we have today. I really believe the genesis of that goes back to the assassination.
Oh, no, I agree 100%. Yeah, he absolutely was the best president we ever had and ever could have. Like, I cannot fathom in my mind a better president. That's not to
No, and
say
it's
he
not
didn't
even
make
close.
mistakes. Yeah.
Sure. I think his
It's,
first 100 days, Monica, was kind of difficult. Like,
yeah.
there was a lot of stuff. I think, the Bay of Pigs, but of course we know that now that, Alan Dulles and the CIA lied to him. And I think he had certain people around him that he realized later on that he couldn't trust. And people inside the military were so hawkish on war. And I think, Kennedy did make some mistakes early on, but once he turned it around after those first 100 days, I mean, it was just amazing what he did in such a short time. I mean, the next thing I want to talk about is his domestic economic policy, because the economy was so good during Kennedy's time, and he kind of destroyed a lot of the myths of economics. Can you talk a little bit about that and how good the economy was?
Yeah. So GNP went up by like 20% during his presidency. And between like the early 1960s and the mid 1960s, unemployment fell by like 50%. He raised the minimum wage, he increased Social Security benefits, and I think reduced the age that people can become eligible for Social Security. He extended unemployment benefits. Inflation was much lower than usual, so prices were really stable. So when you think about these kinds of things, and he decreased taxes, while
Right.
increasing benefits. So you're looking at a guy that decreased taxes, increased benefits, increased minimum wage, kept price stability, which usually you're told, well, if you increase minimum wage, you're going to lose price stability, had massive economic growth during this price stability. You think about all these things, you're like, wait a minute, like even to me, I'm like, how
Well,
did
the
this all
so-called
happen?
experts say that can't happen.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you think about, he was really thoughtful about what he did. He did the investment tax credit to, increase investment, which would hire more workers, et cetera. And then if you grow the economy, your tax base increases. So even though your tax rate goes down, you're actually still collecting more tax revenue. And Kennedy talked about that all the time. He's like, you want full employment, so you get full taxes, and that lets you lower the tax rate. So he understood those
Right.
sorts of things. He lowered interest rates. He supported small businesses. His tax cuts disproportionately benefited small businesses. And so by increasing investment, he was able to lower taxes and increase benefits, and which is, kind of wild. Um, and, he increased minimum wage, but he also reduced taxes for small businesses, so they weren't as impacted by the minimum wage. Although I don't think they were that impacted by it anyway, because he increased minimum wage. I think you had to have $1 million in revenue a year or more, if I remember correctly. But he was just really thoughtful about the way he looked at the economy. And he also wanted to give the president more authority when it came to the economy. So he made proposals where a president could do like a 5% income tax reduction during a recession, or increase public works during a recession, or increase unemployment benefits during a recession. And so basically, he wanted the president to have the ability to react to recessions, which they don't really have too much today, to unilaterally kind of do that. And he gave actually a speech at Yale when he talked about the myth of economics. And he's like, everyone
Right.
loves the comfort of opinion, but they don't like the discomfort of thought. Which I love that quote, and he said, we're surrounded by myths everywhere. Like our whole society is based on myths. And, and he was basically saying we need to think independently about these things. And he was a really independent thinker. And the economy is one of those areas where you can see how independently he thought and how successfully he was able to steer the US economy, in a way that benefited the masses. And you can't imagine that kind of economy today, especially like with the inflation we have going on now.
No.
Like every time I go to the grocery store, food is more expensive. That would have never happened under Kennedy. He was so obsessed, I would say, with keeping inflation low, because he understood what that meant. If inflation went up, then there goes his minimum wage increase. There goes his Social Security increase.
Right.
There goes his Medicare. Like he just knew that everything he was doing was going to be pointless if there was going to be inflation. And he talked a lot about, productivity. It's not like prices that matter. It's not wages that matter. It's the value behind them. And that goes back to his consumer rights pledge. He was really about value rather than numbers, if that makes sense. And I think that's why he was able to create such an impressive economy, and without war. He wasn't
Without
using,
war, right?
yeah,
He
he
was a peace
wasn't,
president.
exactly. He wasn't using war to benefit the economy. It's just insane. Like when I think
It
about
really
his
is. Like,
presidency, I just think like this is what America could be. And it's so different from what we have today.
I
That's
think,
why the
Monica,
powers to be don't want it out there.
yeah, I
Really
think that
happen.
the biggest difference between JFK and almost every other president is that he didn't use his first term as, as a pulpit. He didn't use it to try to get it elected for a second term.
Exactly.
He used it, and I mean, obviously, he never got a chance, but he used his presidency, his short time as president, to help the country.
Yeah, and even
to make us healthier, to make us stronger, to make us better.
Oh, absolutely. And even in her oral history, Jackie Kennedy was asked about the civil rights stuff. And she said JFK was well aware that his push for civil rights might cost him re-election. But he said, sometimes you just have to do something. You have to make a stand, because if you don't, no one ever will. And so he was well aware of the risks he was taking of potentially not being reelected. But even despite all that, his average approval rating was 70% over the lifetime of his presidency.
That's just amazing.
Yeah, it's insane. I'm no president since Bill Clinton has even surpassed an average rating of 50%. So you can see how well received he was by the public, despite the fact that he was pushing civil rights, despite the fact that he wanted to end the Cold War. He was still massively, massively popular.
And you would think those would be positives, right?
Yeah, I know. You would think so, yes. But at the time, they were kind of controversial because he wasn't, following whatever the media was pushing, I guess. So,
sure.
But yeah.
And I just seen a poll.
Go ahead.
I just seen a poll that they had with the last, I think it was 15 presidents or something, in the approval rating of what people think of their term. And Kennedy was like 92%. It was the highest. It was, I think the next closest was like 70%, which I think was Reagan, which is the next thing I want to talk to you about, Monika, because I get so frustrated when people compare anybody to Kennedy, but I've heard a couple different people compare, Reagan to Kennedy, and it's unbelievable. Like, how could you compare, like, Reagan's tax cuts to Kennedy's is like totally different. Like, Reagan was kind of stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. I mean, it was totally different than what Kennedy was doing. Could you talk a little bit about that, like the differences between the two?
Yeah, so Kennedy gave tax cuts across the board, including for the wealthiest. So he brought it down from like 90% to 70%, I think. But the biggest tax cut went to the lowest bracket, which I think went from 21 or 20% to 14%. So he cut them across the board. And, as Reagan, I think, reduced it to like 33%, something like that. And he also, I think, added tax for Social Security, if I remember correctly. That was Reagan.
He did,
yeah. Tax on Social Security, which JFK would never, ever have done that. He increased Social Security benefits. He made more people eligible for Social Security. So that's the exact opposite of what JFK did. But he did believe in, tax cuts across the board because he felt, then there'd be more money to invest in the economy. But that's very, very different from Reagan just giving the rich a bunch of benefits while making the poor person on Social Security and elderly pay taxes. I mean, that's two totally, totally different things.
Totally different. And Kennedy also wanted to tax the foreign profits of U.S. companies, right?
Yes, exactly. So he wanted to keep U.S. industry at home and not abroad. So he was very, very, very big on that.
I can imagine what David Rockefeller thought of that.
Yeah, I don't think he was a fan.
No. And talk a little bit about philanthrope capitalism, because that's really interesting, what goes on today with people like Bill Gates.
Yeah, so Kennedy didn't want people to be able, or wealthy people to be able to deduct 100% of their charitable contributions. And that, to your point, Bill Gates is a perfect example of philanthrope capitalism, because he invests in, let's say, GMOs, patented products that he profits off of, and he calls it charity. So he creates these patented products and he says he's feeding the world. And so he gets a tax deduction for his patented products. So basically, we're all paying for Bill Gates' investments, but we're not reaping the benefits. Only he's reaping the benefits. So I think philanthrope capitalism is a really dangerous thing, because what you call philanthropy is open to interpretation. It's your interpretation that you're feeding the world with these GMOs. Other people might interpret it as you're poisoning the world, you're ruining the environment. There's different interpretations. So who interprets what's charity? And second of all, if you're profiting off it, is it really charity? You know, so
Right.
philanthrope capitalism is a big issue, I think. And I think Kennedy understood that, which is why he didn't want wealthy people to be able to just deduct charity from their taxes.
Absolutely. And the next thing, Monika, I want to talk about, and this is something that just absolutely drives me crazy, is when people in the mainstream media say that Kennedy was slow on civil rights. I mean, the 100 years before Kennedy, nothing got done on civil rights at all. And Kennedy, from the day he was inaugurated, he was worried about why there was not more Black people in the Coast Guard, the Secret Service. And right from day one, he identified civil rights as a very important thing in his administration. So could you talk a little bit about that and how much he actually accomplished? Because he realized that, the Southern Democrats were not going to be for civil rights, and they were going to filibuster all these bills that he was going to try to get through. So he worked around that with the court system and with executive orders. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one executive order he gave is to basically, if companies contract with the U.S. government and they discriminate, that those contracts could be cut. So basically, if you want to contract with the U.S. government, you better not discriminate. He also gave an executive order around housing, no discrimination in housing that's federally funded. He desegregated like national parks, federal buildings, things like that, things like he could control. And there were also a lot of issues he reacted to. So when we had the freedom rides, they made sure that after the freedom rides that the ICC basically desegregated, interstate transportation. So that was all in this first year, right? And he made sure that, kids got into school in Alabama, they were desegregated, and Mississippi. And so he was reacting to these things. And to your point, he didn't introduce a civil rights bill day one because he knew he couldn't. It would never right. pass. And he had all these other bills he wanted to pass, like, the minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment, Area Redevelopment Act, Manpower Training Act, Public Works Act. It's just on and on. All these things he was trying to do, none of those things could have been done. Because when Kennedy came in, the economy was in really bad shape. Like unemployment was close to 8%. So he had to get the economy and America as a whole in decent shape before he could handle civil rights. Because if he did civil rights first, none of that other stuff would have gotten through. And so that's why he sort of waited on it. But you have to understand, like, to your point, nobody did anything for 100 years. No. This guy was doing stuff through executive orders right away, but he wasn't pressuring Congress until his third year, when he finally introduced the civil rights bill in his third year. And even then it had like the longest filibuster in history. And it was really hard to get that through. And it damaged his approval rating because his approval rating dropped like 10% when he submitted that bill. And
half the public thought he was moving too fast on civil rights.
Yes, exactly. So I think there's so little they can really criticize Kennedy for, that I feel like they nitpick when they say, well, he didn't introduce civil rights till 1963. So he's whatever. Like, it's just absurd. It's completely absurd. He was dealing with civil rights issues from day one. In the schools in Virginia, when they had forced desegregation, they closed the public school and opened a private school. I think it was Prince Edward County, and they opened a private school just for the white students. And it was Bobby and JFK that got private funders to open a private school for the Black students in the area because they couldn't get it resolved through the courts. And so they really went out of their way personally to make sure that these students got into school. Like, no president would do that today. You know what I mean?
They basically built a school district.
Yeah.
It's incredible what they did.
So, today they'd be like, oh, we can't do anything about it. Sorry.
Right. Exactly.
So the fact that he gets flack for civil rights is just beyond absurd to me.
It's unbelievable. It really is. It's one of the things I forgot to mention earlier was Kennedy and the Federal Reserve, because we know now that the Federal Reserve is a private bank, and the genius of what they did, they put the word federal in it, but it's privately owned, by people like the Rockefellers have an interest in that, and the government really doesn't have any control, which is unbelievable, over our money supply. But talk about how, like, Kennedy wanted to pull back the powers of the Federal Reserve. He blamed them for causing two recessions, probably contributing to a third. And Kennedy felt that recessions could be avoided, and he wanted to the Fed and give it to James Saxon. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so he did a couple things. One thing he did is he wanted the term of the Federal Reserve Chairman to correspond with the presidential term, so that the president could right away pick the Federal Reserve Chairman they wanted. And the thing you're referring to, the James Saxon thing, who was Kennedy's comptroller of the currency, so they essentially wanted to support small banks and give small banks freedom from the Federal Reserve System, or separate them from the Federal Reserve System, where they could establish their own interest rates. And he wanted to be able to increase loans and increase interest on savings accounts and increase loans to farmers. And he basically wanted these local small banks to have more control over how money is spent, and not allow the Federal Reserve to have control over that. Because Saxon was saying, like, the Federal Reserve should have control over money supply and nothing else. And when you think about today, like central bank digital currencies, where we're potentially facing like complete control over how money is spent, which is the very opposite direction of where Kennedy was going. Because if you have these small, a bunch of small banks, you can't, like when you had the truckers in Canada and they just shut off their funds, that's very dangerous. And when you just have a bunch of big banks and you want society to behave a certain way, it's easy to, and I know PayPal was shutting down people's accounts last few years. And, if you give power to just a few big banks, you can really control society that way. Because if you can prevent people from transacting, you can get them to do anything, because otherwise they starve if they can't transact, right? So I think Kennedy was huge on decentralized power. And that was both domestically, by supporting small banks, by supporting small business, idealistic view of the world. It was a very decentralized society that he wanted to build.
And of course, Johnson would end up getting rid of Saxon, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's crazy. When you look, every single policy area that you look at, except for maybe civil rights, where the civil rights bill still passed and Medicare still passed.
Johnson reversed.
Almost everything just reversed. I mean, it's just like down the line. It doesn't matter what policy area you're talking about. Like 90% of them got reversed. So it's just wild.
And it's amazing that the media and even academia, because we had Professor Paul Blow from Canada on, and he talked about studies he did on how academia treats Kennedy and the assassination. And they even say they'll do this myth that Kennedy to Johnson, not much really changed. And say that and to teach that, because like you said, just about everything except civil rights legislation changed.
Yeah, and I find academia extremely disappointing, particularly when it comes to Kennedy. And I think people have to remember academia is funded. And so you're talking about people that don't want to lose their funding. So you're not going to get a professor to talk about the differences between Kennedy and Johnson and to really display to American people how drastic the change was and how much was lost when Kennedy was assassinated, because then that brings into question motive, right, for murder.
Right.
And they don't want that to come into play. So instead they're like, you know what, Kennedy was really crappy on civil rights. He couldn't get any bills through. Johnson had to get Medicare through, which is nonsense. That was Kennedy's bill. That would have passed if Kennedy was there. Kennedy got tons of legislation through, in his first year.
Right.
And so there's just all these myths around his presidency, which just blow my mind. And yeah, academia is a complete failure when it comes to Kennedy, like a complete failure. I mean, they failed American society when it comes to the topic of Kennedy, because
I agree.
Yeah, it's really sad. It's really sad.
And of course, Bobby stayed on to help make sure that civil rights legislation gets passed. So I think Bobby deserves a lot of credit with that too.
Oh, absolutely. And in his oral history, Bobby even said that Lyndon Johnson just left it with him because Lyndon Johnson
Mhm.
didn't want to be blamed if it didn't pass. And he figured, well, I'll just leave it with Bobby. So whatever happens, if it doesn't go well, it's Bobby's fault.
That's typical Johnson.
Yes.
But let's talk about some of the real changes, like in foreign policy, that Johnson changed with Kennedy, because it's just unbelievable, some of the Kennedy's foreign policy. Because, and I always think that, because Kennedy had Irish roots, that he was really anti-colonialism, because of what he's seen what the British did in Ireland. And I know in '63 when he went to Ireland, he acknowledged the Irish resistance fighters against the British in the 1916 Easter Rebellion. And even RFK, when he came to Scranton, which is only like 20 minutes from where me and Bill are now, he spoke at the Friendly Sons dinner. My dad was there, and he compared, the Irish struggle with the British world. And I think that had a lot to do with Kennedy's sympathies towards, a lot of these third world, where he looked at them as nationalists, and the rest of the people were really looking at them as communists. And he said, no, these people are nationalists, they're not communists. But to start off with the Kennedy, how he identified with the plight of the Palestinians, because that's fascinating to me. And he was writing about them going all the way back to, what was it, 1939? And that's like almost a decade before Israel was even created.
Yeah, I was blown away when I found that letter at the JFK library. Yeah, he went to visit in 1939, so he would have been about 22 then. And he was basically saying, he was writing about how the Israeli side, and again, to your point, Israel hadn't even been created yet, wanted to ultimately colonize all the land, make it their land of milk and honey, is what he called it. They wanted to make Jerusalem their capital. And he said basically the Palestinians were getting shafted in the whole process, that they were basically being colonized, is what he said. And so the fact that he could see that, and we've seen that take fruition, because we see the settlements continue to increase and increase over the decades. And, slowly the Palestinians are just being pushed and pushed and pushed out to where they have almost no land. And whatever little they have, they're living under occupation anyhow. So they really don't have anything anymore. And the fact that Kennedy could see that in 1939 was just really, really impressive to me, because
Incredible
he understood colonialism.
vision.
Yeah, he understood colonialism. And colonialism exists all over the world. it exists in Ireland, it exists in Palestine, it exists in Africa, it exists everywhere. And he saw that. And I think that's why he pursued the policies he did when he was president, is he was trying to, make peace in that region. He supported Palestinian right of return. He was really tough on Israel and other areas as well, particularly nuclear weapons, because obviously Kennedy had real concerns about nuclear proliferation.
Right.
And he also felt like if they had nuclear weapons, that would lead to a lot of conflict in the region. And it would, other countries would try to match them, and build their own nuclear weapons. And then you just end up in this endless arms race. And it was just going to lead to all this instability in the Middle East. And so he really wanted to stabilize that area, and wanted the Palestinians to, to be treated fairly. And I don't think any president since, maybe Carter a little bit, cared about the Palestinians, but because he did, I know Carter wrote that book about apartheid in Palestine.
Right.
But most presidents just haven't really cared about, what's happened to the Palestinians or any other region, Africans, anyone.
No.
They just kind of,
or even Ireland. I mean, they didn't.
Yeah.
The only one really, Bill Clinton was the only one that did anything in Ireland.
Yeah. So
nobody else did.
Yeah. So I think our politicians tend to serve, I guess what I would call like transnational capitalism, like wealth and power, and whoever owns the capital. They're not worried about the little guy that doesn't own anything, and, how he's being impacted by everything. And I think, Kennedy saw that throughout the world. And it was just really impressive to me, that he was an anti-colonialist and an anti-imperialist. And it just makes you wonder how much better the world would be if people would just get along, and just try to treat others with respect and kindness and empathy, the way that he did. And to honor their self-determination, like he really respected people's God-given right to make their own choices, to rule themselves. He always said our rights come from God and not the state. And I think he believed that globally, that every country had its own rights, every people had its own rights to they had their own self-determination. And, that's lost today. There's almost no self-determination anymore, just anywhere really.
One thing I know Bill wanted to talk about this, JFK's Alliance for Progress, which really was just unbelievable. And of course, Rockefeller and Johnson would basically crush that. But talk a little bit about the differences with the Alliance for Progress and with the World Bank and the IMF, which basically, to me, they always looked like they were like a Brooklyn loan shark, like juicing their clients, because they would give these loans to these countries that they couldn't pay the interest on the loans, and then they would basically own them, where Kennedy was giving grants and low interest loans and really, trying to help these countries more than just take them over. Could you talk a little bit about the Alliance for Progress?
Yeah, so Kennedy, when he was campaigning for president, said in a speech that all the aid we give to Latin America just goes to their interest on debt. So we're not actually aiding Latin America; we're transferring that money to the banks. And what he did is he started the Alliance for Progress when he became president. And the idea was supposed to be a decade-long program, and they were supposed to give about $20 billion to the program, some of it in grants, some of it in long-term, low-interest government-to-government loans. And Kennedy basically wanted to develop these societies. So they wanted these countries to use their funds to, grow their own economies, to not become so dependent on primary exports. And those exports that they are dependent on to stabilize the prices so they're not like going up and down all over the place. He wanted to give land distribution or more equitable land distribution, because he said you can't have democracy if you don't have land ownership, right? Because people need a stake in the ground if they're going to have any say in what their country does. He wanted to get rid of illiteracy, because he's like, you can't have a democracy if people are illiterate, right? So he was really looking to grow the education, and he wanted to build roads and schools and, things that can really build a local economy. And so, everything was really about these countries becoming self-sufficient, about becoming independent, about developing and funding it. And Kennedy also talked a lot in his speeches that you need long-term funding. You can't just give funding for a year, because then, some project starts, you start building a road or whatever, and then it just stops because you stop the funding. So Kennedy often talked about you need long-term funding and you need long-term commitments to these third world regions, or they just simply won't develop. And that's why he wanted the Alliance for Progress to be a 10-year program. Now, of course, after Kennedy died, basically the Alliance for Progress died as well. I think that's what Juan Bosch, the leader of the Dominican Republic, said. He said the Alliance for Progress died in Dallas with Kennedy. And then it was just basically, we'll give you military aid if you do what we want after Kennedy. It's just sad. Yeah.
And Monika, when you look at the long-term impacts of it, I mean, and the short-sightedness of what happens today, there's such a fever pitch now about people illegally crossing the border. If you don't want people to illegally come to this country, wouldn't it make sense to help them in their own countries, to help them live not just, good lives, but I mean, just give them basic food and water and shelter.
That's exactly what Kennedy was trying to do.
Exactly. And they clearly don't have that. That's why they're coming to, this country, is because they can't get that. For us, I mean, would you rather give it to them in this country or their native country? For me, it would make more sense. Let's help them in their own countries. Let's help them, even if it means, more money in aid, more money in programs to help them, more people, sending more people there to help them get set up to make sure they have the infrastructure, to make sure they have the correct, education and what we talked about earlier, nutrition, things of that nature. That's how you're going to stop the border crisis, not by building a wall or putting more guards at the border, or by shipping them to to unsuspecting cities. It's so short-sighted what we do today. And Kennedy was such a visionary. He just understood these things. And it's just a shame. It's just such a shame.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And that's an excellent point. And I think had Kennedy's Alliance for Progress been in place these decades, we wouldn't have the border crisis that we have now. There simply would be no reason for people to come here. And I think so few people understand that. But Kennedy understood that. And he always said that aid to other countries benefits America's security and well-being more than military spending does.
Right.
And that's such a simple, basic concept. If you treat others well, you know, they're not going to come back and attack you. If you support them and, you know, being self-sufficient, they're not going to come through the border to try to find a better life. And these are such basic concepts, and yet they're not pursued by our leadership today at all.
No, we try to address the fallout from the issue rather than the issue at its core. And that's just the way that we think. And it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree.
Monika, talk a little bit about JFK in Africa and compared to what JFK was doing compared to what Eisenhower did before him and what Johnson would do later with Africa. And then talk about the quote that Soapy Williams got into a little trouble when he talked about Africa for the Africans and what Kennedy's response to that was.
Yeah, so Eisenhower basically always sided with the colonial powers in Africa, and he didn't give much aid to Africa. He didn't have many ambassadors in the region, whereas Kennedy, I think aid to sub-Saharan Africa like quintupled when Kennedy became president. So he gave tons and tons of aid to the region. He put less restrictions on the aid, which is really important to understand as well. So he didn't require them to side with the U.S. He was fine if they were neutral, which basically meant they didn't side with East or West, that they were just making their own decisions. You know, he supported a lot of nationalist leaders in Africa. He had more leaders from Africa visit the White House per month than any other president in U.S. history. He averaged almost one per month. So he just showered attention on Africa, and he showed them so much respect by giving them that attention. And that Africa for the Africans comment, that is from Soapy Williams traveled Africa, and he basically made this comment, Africa is for the Africans. And that created a little bit of an uproar. And then what happened is, you know, Kennedy was asked about that in a press conference. And he said, well, I don't know who else Africa should be for, which was a really, you know, brilliant answer, because, you know, what he's saying there, what I'm interpreting it is like, you know, hey, you imperialists, get out of here. This is not the land of the imperialists or the colonialists. This is the land of the people of Africa. And they have a right to develop their own land and to live off their own land and not have it stolen or raided from them by others. Yeah, and then obviously after Kennedy passed away, the other thing Kennedy did is he gave ambassadors to every country in Africa. And Jackie actually said in her oral history that, you know, her husband said that those are the exciting places to be as an ambassador, those far off places in Africa rather than in Europe and whatnot. So after Kennedy, basically Africa got a lot less attention. They got a lot less aid. We once again went to siding with the colonial powers. Like in one of the big colonial struggles that Kennedy was involved in when he was president is Angola versus Portugal. And Kennedy sided with Angola. Now, there were some struggles there because there were a lot of pressures on Kennedy because of the Azores military base to essentially, you know, support Portugal so that the U.S. doesn't lose access rights to that military base. But, you know, Kennedy tried to bribe Portugal. He tried to cut funds to them. He tried different methods to get them to give independence to Angola. And then later, when Richard Nixon was president, he told a Portuguese leader, don't worry, I'll never do to you what Kennedy did. And so you could just see the difference there in terms of, you know, after Kennedy, it went back to siding with colonial imperial powers and not siding with the people of Africa.
The next thing, you know, the one thing I want to talk about a little bit is JFK and the steel crisis, what Kennedy did, because to me, just never see a president do what Kennedy did in that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so basically there was the unions were up for renegotiation on their wages, the steel unions, and this was in April 1962. And JFK was worried, as I said before, about inflation. And he was worried if the unions asked for a wage increase, then the steel companies would increase their prices. And because steel is in so many other commodities, it would essentially create an inflationary spiral in the economy, which he felt the economy could not handle. And so he went to the unions and he went to the steel companies and he said, if we can negotiate non-inflationary wage agreement, that would, he said, my administration would be happy to help you guys with this. And they said, sure, we're happy to have your help. And so he was able to work with the unions and agree to a wage agreement that did not require an increase in wages. And so Kennedy thought it was done then, problem solved. But then Roger Blau, chairman of U.S. Steel, went to the White House and basically gave him a memo that he had just distributed to all the press. And he said, we're raising prices by 3%. And JFK was just livid. Jackie said there was like a flash of anger. You could just see a flash of anger in his eyes. She had never seen him so angry. Another person said there should have been a speedometer on his rocking chair because he was, going back and forth so fast. And that's when he made that famous comment. My father always told me, all businessmen are sons of bitches. And I never believed it until now, or something like that. And so he was just livid. And he basically, and then U.S. Steel was the first to increase prices. And then the other major steel companies immediately or very soon after followed suit. So basically you had all the major steel companies raising their prices. And there was no real reason for them to raise their prices because wages had remained stable. The economy was doing great. So their profits were great. And again, this was a simultaneous increase. So there's obviously some sort of price collusion or whatnot going on. And so Kennedy called them out at a press conference. And basically he called them unpatriotic and selfish and greedy and whatnot. And that, and that put a lot of pressure on them. And he also sent the FBI under Bobby Kennedy, the attorney general, after them. And that put massive pressure on them. And within a day or two, they essentially all rescinded their price increase. And you can just see he said that the job of a president, that 14 or 15 million Americans have the resources to have their interests represented in Washington. And the interest of every other American is the responsibility of the president of the United States. So he said that in response to the steel crisis. So he understood that this inflationary spiral was going to be toxic to the U.S. economy as a whole, and that all the gains achieved in purchasing power were going to be wiped out, which is why he was so livid over this. And it's not that he felt that he had control over how companies priced their products, because obviously he didn't, but he felt he deserved transparency and honesty when such price setting had such a massive impact on the U.S. economy. So when they agreed to the wage negotiation, there was an implicit understanding that they wouldn't increase prices. And of course, there's the question of price collusion. And I think they all ended up being fined for price collusion eventually in 1965. So you just see like how much he went after, and he wasn't going to be pushed around. And I think this was a battle, between Wall Street and Kennedy, because Wall Street wanted to control the economy. And this was a power play on their part to tell him, hey, we control the economy, not you. And he responded and said, no, I'm going to stand up for these people, and he got, he won that battle. But it's just very, very intense. And I don't see any president today going at war with any industry, really.
No way. Even before Kennedy, they wouldn't do it.
Yeah, agreed.
Right. And it's one thing to increase prices on, everyday products that people buy. But when you're talking about steel, you're talking about lumber, things of that nature. I mean, these are things that are necessary. And especially during that time, it was such boom times. Buildings were going up left and right. There was people moving away from cities, moving to suburbs, and just there was so much, so many great things happening. There was no reason, as you said, there was no reason for the steel industry to have to increase their prices. And he saw that, and he wanted to make sure that excuse me, that people in this country were getting a fair shake and weren't being raked over the coals. And again, you just don't see that today, and you probably will never see it again.
Yeah, I
Unfortunately,
agree.
Monika, talk a little bit about the energy crisis and how JFK, stressed the importance of, affordable energy.
Yeah, so he gave like a whole conservation tour in the fall of 1963. And he really believed that if you're going to have a robust, decentralized economy, people need access to cheap energy because they need to be able to move their goods, transport their goods. They need to be able to maintain their businesses. Like I know, energy costs have increased drastically in Europe in recent months or recent years. And like small businesses are shutting down because they can't afford their electric bill or they can't afford their gas bill. So Kennedy understood you can't have a decentralized economy unless you have cheap energy. It's just not possible. And so he was very optimistic. When he talked about conservation on his conservation tour, it wasn't, again, going back to that Malthusian, like, oh, we must all sacrifice, we must cut down on our living standards. We have to protect the environment. No, it was like, we're going to be creative. We're going to find ways to, to extrapolate more resources or to, be wiser with our resources, to have cheaper access to energy. He was always very, very optimistic, very positive, and it was always about society as a whole, about using human creativity to benefit society, as a mass, as a whole. It wasn't about, let's, keep these resources for ourselves, kind of thing, and keep everyone else under control. So, it was very, if you listen to that tour, he gave, I don't know, maybe like 20 speeches during that tour, but you can just see the optimism in his voice and in his speeches of where he wanted America to head.
Yeah, it was really amazing the things he did. But Monika, is there anything that we didn't cover yet that you wanted to talk about?
No, I think we covered a lot of good stuff. And I'm glad we talked about stuff that is not commonly talked about, because I feel like, the conversation about Kennedy for so many years has been about Cuba and Vietnam, when there's so much more to his presidency, both domestically and foreign. He was just involved with so many things. I mean, he was an insanely hard worker, insanely thoughtful as a president, very empathetic. Just like I said, I really cannot imagine a better president. Like if I were to come up with an ideal president, I would come up with him. And again, that's not to say he was perfect or anything like that. He was a human being. He made mistakes. There were lots of pressures on him, lots of constraints, demands, whatnot. But given like the system that he was put in, I think he did an incredible job. And he was so committed to doing his job. Like he took the oath he took very, very, very seriously. And I think that can be seen in everything that he did. So it's good to talk about those things because I think people are not aware of the extent of what he was doing and the extent of what we all lost when he died.
And there's one thing we didn't even mention that you just mentioned is Vietnam. We didn't talk about that. One thing that, again, academia likes to blame Vietnam on him, and the media blames it. I seen documentaries, on Lyndon Johnson where they just blame the whole thing on Kennedy. It's just amazing that now, I mean, there's no doubt. I don't know how anybody could even argue the fact that Kennedy was pulling out the advisors. He was never going to escalate that war in Southeast Asia. And that would have been something that if Kennedy lived, there would have been no Vietnam War. That's one thing that I could guarantee. It's just amazing that they try to blame that war on him.
Yeah, I feel like everything bad that Johnson did is blamed on Kennedy, and everything good that Kennedy did is attributed to Johnson. The things that they're willing to talk about, most of it they don't even talk about. Really. But the good stuff like civil rights and, Medicare that did actually get through under Johnson, they're like, oh, that was all Johnson. Kennedy just stammered around. Basically, the image of Kennedy is that he like stammered around for a couple years. He slept with a lot of women. He took drugs. He was like ill and on his deathbed and didn't
hung out with the mafia.
Yeah, hung out with the mafia. And then one day he died and life went on. That's like the mainstream image of Kennedy. It's just
It's bizarre.
mind-boggling. Yeah. It's the polar opposite of reality. So it's just
yeah, and you know, we've had we've had a lot of other authors on, Monika, and they all, you know, in particular, I think about Rick Otto, who really gets upset. You know, he when you think about what was taken from us, you know, and
Right.
how people are just, it doesn't seem to bother people today. And you know, he said, I'm pissed off, and people should be pissed off.
I think people just feel powerless to do anything about it.
Sure. Well, but we're not. I mean, we do have the power of the vote, which, you know, we do have that power where we can put people in place that we like. People, and there aren't that many people out there. There aren't that many politicians. There aren't that many people running for office like JFK who you know, who have that ability, who have that drive, that desire to help us, to help the country, to help, really help the world.
Well,
there's just aren't that many people.
We talked about this before, though, Bill, that, you know, they all understand that there's a line that they can't cross, and if they do cross that line, you know, they understand what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, but I think we're smart enough today.
You know, what happened in Dallas.
Sure, but I think we're smart enough today to understand what happened then. You know, the public at large didn't really understand what happened. They didn't until years and years and years later. Nobody really knew what happened, and now the
narrative was controlled right from the beginning. You know,
of course,
we're going to control the narrative and get the story out that they wanted, and that became the official story. And we now know that it's a complete lie, and it's just complete nonsense. But Monika, what you do in the book, fantastic, is just, you know, the world JFK envisioned compared to the world that we ended up with, and, you know, it's just what he would see if he could see what the world ended up with today. I mean, I can't imagine what he would think, because I mean, it's just a complete disaster, and you know, so much would have been better if Kennedy lived, and I can't imagine what a second term with Kennedy would have been. It just would have been phenomenal.
Yeah, I think the loss is tremendous, and I think they try to obscure it in a lot of ways with the propaganda they push. So they'll say, oh, he stole the election, he wasn't a legitimate president, oh, he was really ill, he was going to die anyway. So all of that kind of pushes the idea that nothing was lost, you know, like he was illegitimate, he was on his deathbed, who cares? But what I wanted to really convey in my book is a lot was lost, and it matters. It matters a hell of a lot. It matters to our lives every day. And we really need to realize that as a country.
I don't think we can move on until the truth comes out. I mean, I think, you know, the truth has to come out, what happened, and I don't think we can move on. I think we're stuck in this rut, and things are just, they're awful everywhere. And I think a lot, you know, it has to do with that assassination. I mean, they got to come out and tell the truth. And we talked about this, you know, we had Lisa Pease on, we had Jim D'Eugenio, and a lot of the things come back to Alan Dulles. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that he was one of the masterminds. And I think at this point, the CIA should just come out and just say, you know, we had a lot of bad apples. This is what Lisa Pease said, you know, we had a lot of bad apples back in the day, and they did this, and, you know, it was a coup d'etat, and let's move on from it. And I don't think you can't fix the problems if you don't even, you know, tell the truth, the true history of what happened.
Yeah, you can't fix a problem until you acknowledge it. You know, that's the first step, is to acknowledge that there's a problem. Yeah, and that's, you can't, until we do that, I don't think we can. I agree, we can't move forward as a country.
I agree. Well, Monika, I know we've taken up a lot of time here, but thank you very much. I mean, and again, I recommend everybody to get out and read Monika's book. We have a bookshop up on our website. You can get the book there. It's a fantastic book, and it's a lot of things that we talked about today that people need to know, and unfortunately they don't know about Kennedy. And there's no doubt he was the greatest president, and you know, you convey in that book what we lost is just unbelievable, and it was just an amazing book. So thank you very much for writing, and thanks for giving us some time here today Billy, you got anything else?
Yeah, just, America's Last President, What the World Lost When It Lost John F. Kennedy. That's the title of the book. Monika Wiesak, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, and thank you for having me on. I enjoyed chatting with you.
All right. All right, John, that's going to do it. That's enough out of you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
All right.